intrinsic as possible. No, if you take a sheet of paper and you make a drawing on your sheet of paper. This is my sheet of paper, I do some drawing on it. If I bend the sheet of paper, from an embedding point of view, it will be very different. But the figure here will remain the same. So if I look at it intrinsically, it should be the same object. And geometry made huge progress when it started to think in intrinsic terms, even for curved geometries. This is related to the development of the non-Euclidean geometries in the 19th century, and in particular the so-called hyperbolic geometry, which was devised by people like Gauss, Lobachevsky. Hyperbolic geometry, like the Euclidean geometry, was a geometry in which all points were equivalent, no privileged point. A sphere also is such a geometry, you know. On a sphere, from any point, the sphere looks just the same. There are very few geometries which have this property of looking the same. And the hyperbolic geometry is one like this. But somehow it's the inverse of the sphere. While the sphere is always positively curved, the hyperbolic plane is always negatively curved. And it has some weird properties. Here is an example of a picture in the hyperbolic plane of these lines, which are all geodesic lines, meaning shortest path. And we are making it rotate like we would do to rotate a figure by rotation in the plane. See how unusual it looks. Here is a famous rendition of the hyperbolic geometry by M.C. Escher, the famous artist. And you see, hyperbolic geometry is a geometry in which units of length will change from place to place in a plane representation. I told you intrinsically every point is the same, but when we represent it on the plane, we are forced to make it having dimensions that change from place to place. So that in this, each fish has the same length as any other fish. This is hyperbolic geometry. And you may ask, okay, but now can I represent this hyperbolic geometry in such a way that the distances are not distorted, like I would do on the sphere? Can I embed this hyperbolic geometry in our three-dimensional space? And this is a problem which already tormented Gauss in the early 19th century. He thought, there's a problem in there. There's a problem. And it was a huge progress when Riemann, the student of Gauss, said, let's not worry whether it's embeddable or not. Let's go on and work with the intrinsic properties, and we'll make progress from this. And he defined the so-called curvature, which to this day has remained the most important tool used by geometers to study non-Euclidean geometries, the Riemann curvature. Without Riemann curvature, general relativity would never have existed, and an enormous amount of everything that we see in image processing could not exist either. And Riemann set up the axiom that we still use to this day to describe non-Euclidean geometry, the concept of Riemannian manifold, which is a geometry in which each point is in a neighborhood resembling a distorted Euclidean space. This was a marvelous achievement, and one in which you say, let's forget whether it can be embedded. So we can treat much more general situations. Okay, looks much more general. Is it really? Is it really more general than embedded geometry? Can one embed hyperbolic space, for instance? Can we have a representation of the geometry that I showed you, which would be set in our three-dimensional space without distortion? Answer is no. We can have approximations. We can have some partial geometries with some so-called singularities like crests, like on these representations. This one on the right top is called the pseudosphere. Below it, it's called the Kuhn surface. And on the left, bottom corner is called the hyperbolic crochet. I have one here. Let's hand it over to you. And you may pass it from people to people, okay? That's the hyperbolic crochet. You can distort it and so on, and reflect on the fact that every point of this has the same geometric properties as the others. And that if you try to continue this for knitting and knitting, there are recipes from this. You find this online, how to do hyperbolic crochet. If you try to make a very large one, you will fail. Such a knitting, such a crochet has to be rather limited. And it was proven by some of the famous mathematicians of 20th century. Hilbert, for instance, proved it's impossible to have a very large hyperbolic crochet. So, okay, this seems like, yes, the embedded geometry is restricted. And there are some geometries like the hyperbolic space that we cannot embed. And I know. Then the mathematician will tell you, okay, we cannot embed it in our three-dimensional space. But who said we need 3 dimensions? Let's dream. Let's embed it in a space of 4 dimensions maybe, or 5 or 6, whatever. It was proven by Blanusa that you can embed the hyperbolic geometry infinitely large in a 6-dimensional space. So in the end, it is embedded geometry all the same. But we just needed to enlarge the point of view. And now you may say, is it the same for any geometry? So here's the rule. I give you an abstract geometry, an abstract surface for instance. Can you find a Euclidean space, a straight space, but possibly with 10 or 20 or 100 dimensions, in which I can embed my geometry, such that it will be a part of that geometry, as the sphere is part of the 3-dimensional geometry. And this was a problem that stood open ever since the time of Riemann. All respectable
It affects how well your car works. It affects all kinds of things in your life. So you do create your own reality. You create it in several ways. You create it, one, because of your interpretation. Something happens, you interpret it. Now, a person who is grown and has a lot of love and caring, something happens that's bad, it won't make them angry. They just deal with it in a pleasant way, and that probably diffuses greater anger, so they don't have to then deal with the reaction to the reaction to the reaction. So it gets better. It doesn't mean that nothing ever bad happens to you. It just means you optimize your reality as you go. So one, what's inside of you, your intent helps create what happens. The second thing is that you have beliefs, and your beliefs and what you understand and your limitations and your experience interpret everything. So that's another way you create your reality. Somebody says something to you and you interpret it as a rude remark, or somebody's, they're making fun of you when maybe they didn't mean that at all. That's just your interpretation. So you create your reality that way as well. So most of what we encounter in life is self-made. Most of our problems are self-made. Most of our tragedies are self-made. That's just the way it is. And some of them are there because we need them as lessons. Some of them are there because we generate them. And while I'm talking about generating things, we'll talk about fear for just a moment. Fear has that property that what you fear, you manifest. Fear tends to manifest itself. So if you're afraid that nobody will like you, you will probably act in a way to make people like you less. If you're afraid that you are not adequate, you will probably act in a way that will be inadequate. You tend to generate, you tend to manifest your fears. If you fear that you're going to get ill and die, you have a higher probability of getting ill and dying. Okay? The mind modifies your reality.